Once upon a time, when clear rivers flowed through England's green fields and quiet woods, there lived an agile and beautiful fish-eating mammal called the otter. Of course, the otter isn't just a fairy tale animal yet. There are still some left, here and there. In Scotland and central Wales, they're even quite common. And there are several pairs still in East Anglia. But unless a drastic improvement is made in the state of the waterways, the otter could become as shadowy a memory in Britain as the wolf or the bear. The debate about the otter used to hinge on whether it had a significant effect on fish stocks. Then it was a question of whether human hunting had any effect on the otter population. But now it's more basic. The question today is, can any otters survive at all? Like Ratty, the water rat in The Wind in the Willows, a lot of people consider that there is nothing, absolutely nothing, half so much worth doing as simply messing about in boats. The Norfolk Broads is one of the most popular places for doing it. But the waterways at the height of the season are now more like motorways. As the bank drifts slowly by, some of its inhabitants make a brief appearance. Perhaps a water vole, Ratty's original. Or a solemn heron, eyeing the vole as a prospective meal. But an otter is a very rare sight indeed. There are two reasons. One is that the otter is active mainly at dusk and at night. But the other is that over most of Britain there just aren't any otters to see. To us humans, a quiet riverbank is a place for peaceful recreation, walking or fishing, or just sitting about. The otter's walks are purposeful territorial patrols. Fishing is his livelihood, and even lazing about requires absolute freedom from disturbance. This last freedom is one which the otter is rapidly losing. It's not a new idea to spend holidays afloat. Ratty said that he disliked river steamers because they flung bottles. And that was in a book written in 1908. What is new is the number of floating holidaymakers. That's what causes a headache for the otter. But there are still some quiet places left, in rivers that are too shallow for boating, away from the main playgrounds. And where there's peace and clean water, there might still be otters, even, just occasionally, in daylight. It might even be the case that otters were originally active by day and were driven into nocturnal habits by man's disturbance. The otter leads a solitary life for most of the time by choice. The old country belief that there is at most one otter to 6 miles of stream may well be true. At any rate, the otter seems well content with its own company. If we had to choose one word to describe an otter, that word would have to be playful. In the animal world, play is the privilege of creatures fortunate enough not to have to seek their food or their waking hours. Young animals, cared for by their parents, and carnivores which need to feed only once or twice a day, are the ones with time to spare for play and exploration. Investigating a mallard's nest on the bank is sheer curiosity. Otters don't eat eggs, and the ducklings will leave the nest as soon as they're hatched. Otters breed in a holt, a burrow in the riverbank, often with its entrance underwater for added security. Here, the female rears her litter of 2 or 3 cubs without any assistance from their father. In an area where otters are at their natural density, a male may well have another female in his territory. For the first 4 weeks, the cubs are blind, and their mother has to spend most of her time in the holt, cozy with its lining of reeds and sedges. Otters breed all the year round, and especially in winter, the insulation of the nest is vital in the damp soil of the river bank. For 7 or 8 weeks, the cubs stay in the nest all the time, totally dependent on their mother for food, warmth, and protection. Although adult otters have no natural predators, the small young in the holt are vulnerable to raids from stoats or even rats. As they grow, their first dark, silky coat appears. The hair's fine and closely packed to provide the insulation and waterproofing they'll need later in life. Soon, with the restless energy of all young animals, they will have exhausted the possibilities for exploration within the holt. Their bedding has been tasted and chewed once too often, and the call of the world outside becomes just too strong. In their first forays, the cubs don't go far from the holt, and they stick close together. Gradually, by degrees, they begin to learn the geography of their part of the river bank. The shrill piping whistle of the young cubs is what is known as a contact call. From it, their mother knows where they are, so long as they're within earshot. She herself uses a louder version of the same call to bring her offspring to heel, or in this case, to call them back to the holt. At this age, the cubs still depend on their mother, not only for food, but for hygiene as well. Two months after they're born, the cubs first begin to eat fish, caught by their mother and brought to the holt. The otter has quite an appetite for fish. A 5-pound youngster will eat more than its own weight in fish every week. And in that time, an adult can account for as much as 20 pounds. The otter's love of fish has brought it into trouble in the past, but fish isn't its only food. Frogs, wild duck, moorhens and young rabbits are fair game to a hungry otter to vary its diet. For the youngsters in the nest, though, the concentrated protein of fresh fish is what they need if they are to grow into healthy adults. As their exploration outside the holt gets wider, the young otters soon need to learn about water. Some of them take to it more readily than others. The otter's eyes can see well underwater, probably better than out of it. As the first youngster gets the feel of the stream, it's already snatching quick glances toward the bottom, even though the water here is only about 6 inches deep. The second youngster is quite different. This new substance, cold, wet, and unstable looking, seems a poor substitute for the riverbank. It's the last place a warm, dry otter would want to go. Finally, the exploratory urge overcomes the otter's inbred love of comfort, and it takes, if not the plunge, at least the first few strokes of a lifetime swimming. The muddy water under the roots of a tree is about as uninviting as anything could be. In time, the otter will know that this is a good place to find crayfish or frogs, but for the present, it's the exit he's looking for. Finally, the example of the bolder of the twins is enough to start the timid cub off into the stream. Especially when they're young, otters need regular periods of warmth and drying out between swims. This is the time when quiet, undisturbed riverbanks are essential to them. Like puppies or kittens, or indeed human babies, the otter cubs learn about their world by biting and tasting everything in sight, gradually building up a catalogue of their surroundings. Unlike their mother, close by but invisible, the cubs have still to learn the importance of caution and concealment to an otter in the 20th century. During daylight hours, the most likely sighting of otters is 2 or 3 cubs at play. Hiding away isn't really their style. A fully grown otter has no natural enemies. The otter has one implacable, unnatural enemy, though, and that's man. At least since the 12th century, fishermen have seen otters as their rivals. The fish that the otter takes, though, are usually those that today's anglers catch for fun and then throw back. Small, coarse fish like chub and roach form the bulk of its diet, rather than trout and salmon, which are too fast and hard to catch. Above all, though, the otter loves eels, those arch-enemies of the game fisherman, which eat the fry of the trout he wants for himself. To an otter, an eel is a good square meal, or a long, narrow one at any rate. Again, like other carnivorous animals, the otter plays with its food. It's cat and mouse in 3 dimensions. By analyzing otter droppings, scientists have shown that even in trout streams, the otter's diet contains only 3% trout and 4 times as many eels. Most of their food is smaller fish, like sticklebacks. You'd think that the otter would be the fisherman's friend, but the opposite has been the case. Fishermen have tended to regard otters as interfering thieves, vermin to be hunted out of the waterways. In the past, hunting must have been one of the reasons for the otter's decline. Otter hunters used to work their way along rivers with packs of specially bred hounds, harrying the otters until the hounds could catch them. Their justification used to be that otters were stealing the fish. Attitudes have changed over the years, though. And in fact, most present-day anglers would probably be pleased and excited to see an otter during a day's fishing. Otter hunting is now a thing of the past, since the otter became a protected animal. Up until Victorian times, though, and even more recently in some places, it was regarded as a worthy sport for the country gentleman. The records of the otter hunts a century or more ago show that there were still plenty of otters to find. Today, the principal threat to the remaining otter population is no longer the hounds and stickles of the hunters, but people who have probably never given otters a thought, let alone seen one. The ever-increasing disturbance to our waterways may be the last straw for the otter. Even in quiet, peaceful places, though, all is far from well. If you walk beside a clean, tree-lined stream with banks suitable for burrowing and plenty of vegetation to provide cover, you're in the ideal place to look for the elusive otter. "I am looking," said the mole, in the wind of the willows again, "at a streak of bubbles that I see traveling along the surface of the water." The mole's first introduction to the otter was typical. The bubbles are often the first sign that one is around. They're produced not by the otter's breathing, but by trapped air being driven out from under its fur as it swims. When it paddles on the surface, the otter is patrolling its territory, on the lookout for intruders or danger, rather than a meal. The number of waterways quiet and clean enough to support otters is dwindling fast. Even in quiet enough places, the water is all too often polluted by chemicals washed off neighboring fields. The most recent, and possibly the last sudden dip in the otter population in the 1950s, coincided with a great increase in agricultural pesticides. Now that the persistent poisons are no longer widely used, another threat to otters has become more important. Large areas of marshland, where the few survivors might find food and shelter, are being drained for farming. The drainage ditches are kept so clean and tidy that the chances of fish and frogs breeding in them and acting as a food supply for otters are very slender. As the land under cultivation increases, the farmer's gain is the otter's loss. Of course, the farmers must have land, and so the drainage is necessary. But it means that the poor otters have to move on. And move they do, from one river system to another, even when they're not being driven by progress. Young animals looking for a territory of their own, or adult males on hunting expeditions, may make long overland journeys, through woodlands and across open country. It's this exploratory tendency which makes it hard to provide sanctuaries for wild otters. It would be relatively straightforward to protect their breeding and resting areas, but a single otter may have a territory 10 miles in diameter. It's not just the rivers that must be safe, but the routes from one feeding place to another. Providing protection on that scale in the modern world is a very difficult matter. It's difficult, too, to justify protecting an animal which so few people ever see. But if there are otters around a stream, they leave signs of their presence. Paw marks in the mud are one clue to look for, with the marks of webbing between the toes. Sometimes the fragmentary remains of fish, just scales and a few teeth, show that the area is within the territory of one of the last of the otters. Otters mark the routes about their territory with their droppings, properly called by the old-fashioned term spraint. Each otter highway has regular sprainting places. The habit of using regular routes can be the death of an otter. There's an otter black spot where the coast road crosses the River Glaven in Norfolk. Otters use the culvert under the road as a safe crossing place. But in winter, when the water level is high, they have to cross the road on the surface, and they are regularly killed by cars. An answer has been found to this particular problem. A body called the Otter Trust has raised the money to build another culvert under the road, well above the winter flood level. The Otter Trust is based in Norfolk, one of the last strongholds of the otter in England. By patient detective work, its members have located regular sprainting places, often beside man-made landmarks, as a way of establishing which territories are still occupied. Now, the Nature Conservancy is doing similar work all over Britain, and as a result, two other relatively well-populated areas have been found in Wales and Western Scotland. With the exception of those two places, and Norfolk though, the outlook for the otter is bleak. Even in Devon, where the numbers were high until a few years ago, otters are seldom seen. We tend to think of otters as freshwater animals, creatures of rivers and streams, but they regularly go to the sea, particularly in Norfolk, where the boundary between land and sea, saltwater and fresh, is often diffuse. A coastal marsh like this is a good hunting ground for crabs and flatfish on the muddy bottom. What looks like a sea monster in the evening light may often be an otter reaping the harvest of low tide. On the low-lying coasts of Norfolk, the shore is just a place to look for food. But in Scotland, otters actually make their halts and rear their young beside sea lochs. And not only sea lochs, they breed in Loch Ness too. Indeed, some skeptical scientists have suggested that many of the reports of Nessie, the Loch Ness monster, are actually families of otters out fishing. Watching this Norfolk monster on the prowl, you can see what they mean. Otters have no particular adaptations to life in salt water, but they seem to manage perfectly well. Crabs are one popular food item among the plants at the marsh edge or out on the bottom of the creek. Sometimes it's not quite clear who has caught whom. In this extraordinary sequence, a crab makes a last-ditch stand by seizing the otter firmly by the lip. The bite a bit, you might say. It's one of the drawbacks of a taste for really fresh seafood. In the past, it was hunting that reduced the otter's numbers. In the present, it's pollution and disturbance. And in the future, it will regrettably, but almost certainly be the drainage of marshland and the tidying up of riverbanks. Both will destroy the otter's habitat. In its stronghold in East Anglia, there may be only 35 pairs left. Elsewhere, urgent surveys are in hand to find out just how many, or how few, survive. There is a chance to save the otter. The work of the Nature Conservancy and the Otter Trust is directed to that end. Even if our only personal experience of otters is a once-in-a-lifetime glimpse beside some darkening stream, it's a pleasant thought that we share some of our most beautiful countryside with such joyful and agile creatures. It would be tragic if the otter finally vanished from our streams, to survive only in the memory of fairy tales.